So now we're going to get into genre and setting of Romeo and Juliet. We're going to look and see what is the play's genre, what are some of the themes present in the story, and what's the setting of the play. So first of all, the genre is kind of like the literary category or type of literature something is. This play is considered a tragedy. It's a kind of literature in which the main character suffers great sorrow or is brought to ruin or destruction. Tragedy is usually the consequence of that person's own tragic or character flaw, moral weakness, inability to cope with a bad situation, and it ends badly. So in a tragedy, the ending is unhappy, yet there is purpose or meaning to it. So there's a point. It's not just an unhappy movie that ends unhappy with no point. There's a lesson to learn from the events in the story. And that's why it's important to recognize that, the play is a tragedy, but there's also some important themes to draw out of it or lessons to draw out of it. Now, you might have read stories with characters who have a tragic flaw that lead to their own demise or destruction. Okay. But it's important that even in a sad story, we still pull out a moral of the story. If there's no moral to the story and it's sad, then it's just a bad story. Okay. Let's go ahead and look and see some of the themes in the story, possibly that we could look at. Now, there are way more than this. This is a play studied by people continuously, for centuries at this point. A theme, an overall theme is the main idea of the story or the message the author wants the reader to understand. The message is usually about life, society, or human nature. And there are tons we could pull out of Romeo and Juliet. Some of them, the slides here that I use will give you hints to. Others will be ones that I point out and focus on a little bit. But there are many themes. Shakespeare wanted the reader to understand a lot about people through this story, and we certainly can. You could spend your life studying the story and pull out different themes and complexities within the storyline. But there's a few here that like to be, very typical Romeo and Juliet type themes, and they are love, hate, and fate. So love, fate, and hate. Of course, love and hate being extreme opposites. What's the power of love? What is the power of hate? The destructive power of hate. Fate. How are the characters in no control to control their destiny? They're victims of their own fate. Is something else you could look at. Now, when we look at it in ELA 9, I also like to look at the significance of family, the significance of friendship, how the play shows the importance of those things. And of course, how the play shows love, because it is a romantic story of love. And also how the play shows friendship and loyalty. I pointed out friendship already, but like loyalty and who do our loyalties belong to. So I like to look at some of those themes also. Now, this play is going to consist of elements of tragedy, romance, and humor. Romeo and Juliet's a tragedy, which means, sad things are going to happen. The play's about love, the play's about death. Many people cry at the end of the story. You'll probably cry at the end of the story, okay? Because I don't want to give it away, but the main characters die. So it's sad, even though we expect it to happen, because everybody knows the story of Romeo and Juliet. It's still sad. It's still sad, sad, sad. So you're going to find also romance in the play. So maybe you like that type of thing. Watch out for Romeo. He really knows how to get a girl's attention. He's actually infatuated with love itself, whether or not his love is good for him or not. But also how he can kind of woo Juliet, and kind of the whole sequence of the story as they fall in love. We'll see. Okay. These are sometimes really cheesy. Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair. Okay, wrong story. But you know what? There is balcony scene here. And if Juliet did have long hair, she could have thrown it down and Romeo could have climbed up that way. So there's an element of similarity. I was making a text-to-text connection there. And the play has humor in it too. Now, some of the humor is kind of dirty and nasty, and adults and kind of sicko, people might get it. Less and less because the language is complex. But there's also jokes, I think, that are just funny in the characters that I think everybody will understand and find is innocent enough. Romeo and his friends joke around with one another. They make fun of, mock people. Maybe there's coincidences in the storyline that we might find humorous. Okay, and we have different characters like Juliet's nurse, who's a funny character, or different characters who are specifically put there to add humor to the play. We want to pay attention to what they say and how they act because they're meant maybe to be more comedic versus tragic. And we can begin to also discuss, is Shakespeare responsible for balancing out the tragedy with humor for his audience so that we're not just like crying furballs at the end, but we also have had a good time because it's been clever and funny also. Now, what's the setting? Well, the setting of a play or a story is the time and place and social environment that the characters find themselves in. The setting is identified by observing what the characters see, hear, feel, so we can feel the atmosphere of or the kind of environment of the characters and what they're experiencing. It can also be stated so we kind of know where in the world perhaps that story takes place and maybe when. The setting is important because it creates the mood of the story as well as gives hints about what may happen next. And we have a setting revealed in Romeo and Juliet, so let's take a look at that. Our time period is the 13th or 14th century in the country of Italy. In the north part of the country of Italy, exactly where the Italian outbreak of COVID occurred. Both parents are very rich and wealthy in this story. So Romeo and Juliet's families are wealthy. They dress in fancy clothes, have things like servants. And that's kind of the setting that we have. Now, we know also the story takes place in the city of Verona, which is a real city in northern Italy. And now that you know, let's take a look at some of the other details. As I mentioned, Verona, Italy, which is up here, this is Italy, right here. Okay, up here in Milan and Verona. Okay, I went to Milan once, kind of neat. Okay, Verona, I've never been to. If I knew it was that close at the time, I maybe would have made the effort, but maybe next time, right? But they live in Verona with their families, and it's actually a site of tourism today, no doubt, because of the fame of the story Romeo and Juliet, as made famous by William Shakespeare. You can go to the Casa di Juliet, or the House of Juliet. And we don't actually know if it's really Juliet's house, but a statue of Juliet stands in the courtyard, and you can go in and tour it with lots of other tourists who are fans of Romeo and Juliet, which you soon will be too. We can tour that to this day. They got a cool website and a 360 panning view of it, and I'm sure we have tourists probably posted YouTube content on it and whatever, but you could also go there in person. And then let's look at the context of this 1300s, 13th century Verona. Many of the characters will fight in the streets of Verona. It's kind of lawless in that sense. In fact, a lot of fighting takes place in the streets of Verona with the weapons that they would have had, swords and rapiers. In spite of its medieval churches, the ancient squares, today's Verona is quite a modern and industrial city. Being in northern Italy, we know that's the source of Italian industry. But back then, okay, you have this idea of these cobblestone streets and town squares and huge churches and fountains and whatever, and people walking around, with these types of clothes and swords and that type of stuff. Another place in the play we'll come across is the Capulet household. We actually don't ever see the Montague household, but the Capulet household, which was Juliet's family, is another place. That's her house. Now, they're quite wealthy, so their home is more like a manor or small palace. Juliet has her own room with a balcony, it overlooks an orchard. Like, it's a big, massive palace in the city of Verona. We have this masquerade ball at the beginning of the play. That happens in Juliet's home, so where they come to the play decked in a mask. And the famous balcony scene, of course, I mentioned. Juliet's room has a balcony outside Juliet's bedroom, and it has its own balcony. So I don't know, that'd be cool. Have a balcony out your room. So that wraps up this look at genre and the setting of the story. So let's take a look at the next part. Welcome to this part. I think it's part 4 here, where we're looking in our introduction at the literary elements and the structure of a play. So let's give this a shot. So the first thing we want to look at is how Shakespeare uses soliloquies and asides, or really how asides and soliloquies occur in any sort of drama or play. So what is the difference between the two? What are they, and what's the difference between them? Okay, and how do they happen? So sometimes in a play, a character is going to talk to themselves out loud, and some talk for quite a long time. It might be a full page worth of lines where they share. And they're talking to themselves. And when a character does this, it's called a soliloquy. And why would they do that? Well, I might ask you this. How is a character supposed to tell you what they're thinking unless he speaks out loud? I mean, what's going on in his head? How does he tell you that as the audience? And he tells you that by speaking a soliloquy. So Shakespeare will often use that soliloquy in his plays to let a character express his private thoughts, especially in a tragedy where such a kind of hidden, secretive love story like Romeo and Juliet, where the characters are constantly thinking to themselves and speaking that out loud, their private thoughts and feelings about what's going on. These speeches are performed when the character is alone on stage, and soliloquies are a way for us to connect and better understand that character. So they talk to themselves, and you overhear it. But the point is that you get to overhear it. And we might say normally a person would just think that thought in his head and not have to speak it out loud. So the next is the aside, and the aside is kind of like the soliloquy in that a character is speaking something that the audience is meant to hear and others are not. A character will be on stage with other characters, speak what he's saying out loud, but it's as if the other characters on stage are not meant to hear what the character has spoken. So the actor either speaks an aside to himself, like he hears something and says, "Oh man, what a loser," and he's saying that to himself aside, and the person next to him is not meant to understand that or hear it. Just the audience is meant to overhear that. Or the character is also speaking perhaps secretively to a friend or buddy next to him, something that he says out loud to this person who this person is not meant to hear. Okay. Sometimes the actor might even look at the audience and speak directly to them to kind of get their reaction to the situation too. And that kind of involves the audience a little bit, even though it's not meant to involve the person on the stage with that character speaking the aside. And it's a clever device, really. I think it's neat. It shows, and I want to know if you can read this play and figure out an example of when a soliloquy happens and when an aside happens. They do happen through, so I may point those out. Maybe you'll catch them yourself. But I think it's interesting because we all know that, a soliloquy might be spoken, but nobody's meant to hear the secret thoughts of a character on stage, even though all the audience will know the secret thoughts of the character on stage. Or an aside, which is meant to keep secret information that is revealed to the audience through a character that another character on the stage is not meant to hear, even though we know full well that the actor on stage can hear it as perfectly as we can as the audience. So quite interesting use of soliloquy and aside. The next to discuss is the idea of blank verse. So let's see if we can do this. So blank verse is poetry that doesn't rhyme. It is in verse, though. In other words, it has a metered pattern to it, a syllabication. And in this case, Shakespeare's writing in what's called iambic pentameter. So if you don't get anything else out of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, yet you know how to define iambic pentameter, that is bragging rights probably to the majority of the people on the world who don't know what iambic pentameter is. So figure out what it is, and I think you'll impress a lot of people. At least that's my opinion. But iambic means this. So let's look at what iambic means, and then let's look at what pentameter means, or pentameter. Iambic means a unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, as mentioned down here. Okay, stress, unstressed. Okay, or sorry, unstressed and then stressed. In any case, how many syllables is it? 2. 2 syllables. An iambic pattern is 2 syllables. Unstressed by a stressed. Da-da, da-da, da-da. Okay? Just like this. Da-da, 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 Da, 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 da. Now we could probably figure out pentameter. Penta means 5, and meter is the rhythm of a line. So pentameter means the iambic pattern is repeated how many times? 5, as distinguished by these lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in essence, how many lines or how many syllables in each line? In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, there are 10 syllables in each line. Now, this is a whole new dimension of wow. When you go and you write a play and you decide, I'm going to write a play, but I'm going to write it with an unstressed and stressed syllable pattern repeated 5 times in each line, so I can have exactly 10 syllables every line I write. Okay, you go and try to write 5 lines of 10 syllables and see what it looks like. Okay, Shakespeare's writing a whole play, and for the most part, every line is 10 syllables. Okay, now what does it sound like? Well, we know what an iambic pattern sounds like because we've all read Dr. Seuss and Green Eggs and Ham. So go ahead and take a look at Green Eggs and Ham sometime. It says like this. It goes like, I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. I would not eat them in a house. I would not eat them with a mouse. Or whatever. I would not eat them here or there. I would not eat them anywhere. Okay, that's your iambic pattern. In this case, the story Green Eggs and Ham is not written in pentameter style, but we get the idea. So then when we go to Shakespeare, we go, they are the faction, no conspiracy. Shamest thou to show thy dangerous brow by night? And we have iambic pentameter right there. 1, 2 lines of iambic pentameter right there from Act 2, Scene 1, line 77 and 79, if you want to look at the reference point of that line. Another point to make is that sometimes authors will cheat so that they get the right syllables in the story or the words that they want. So you're going to see abbreviated words like this, shamest, instead of shamest, shamest, or you should be shamed, shamest, or dangerous. Dangerous is actually 3 syllables, dangerous, dangerous. But if you put this little apostrophe, you could say dangerous, and it's 2 syllables. So they'll cheat just like our modern songwriters cheat when they're syllabicating their own lyrics. They're going to abbreviate words all the time, or maybe even add an extra syllable from time to time. But the idea is that there's 10 syllables there, however you get that pattern, however you do it. 2 more things. One is who speaks typically in blank verse or iambic pentameter, and that is aristocracy or important characters. So the educated people in the play will speak in this sophisticated way of 10-syllable lines. And those who are not educated, so servants and unimportant characters, will not. So that's a comedic thing. It's kind of funny. Shakespeare would make the uneducated people not able to speak iambic pentameter. So keep that in mind. What do you think? What do you think you would be able to speak if you were in the play? Would you be one of the aristocratic members of the play, educated, able to speak in iambic pentameter? And then the last thing is that sometimes Shakespeare does throw a rhyme in there, a rhyme at the end. And if I rhymed this last word with this last word, then I have a rhyming couplet. I've got a rhyming set of lines that have a strict set of syllables and a rhyme at the end. And it actually sounds poetic. So sometimes you may find rhyming words, so don't be shocked if you do. Okay, we have this technique of foreshadowing, especially in a tragedy. We know, this author knows that we know it's going to end tragically. And the story is so famous, we already know it's ending. And in fact, the foreshadowing is so evident of what's going to happen that it's obvious he's going to use foreshadowing here. It's not difficult, in other words, to figure out what's going to happen to Romeo and Juliet. So we already know the literal ending, but the question is, and by the way, we're going to read the prologue to start off the story. It's going to tell us that the star-crossed lovers take their own life and that they're going to die. So we know that right away. It's not giving away anything to foreshadow or to reveal that fact. But the thing is this, it's very, very clever because we know the ultimate ending of the story to pick up on the hints or clues that support the ending that we already know. And those are going to be, we've got a better chance to foreshadow or to find examples of foreshadowing in this play than in many other stories, just because we know where it's going. And we can be like, oh, there's a hint right there. Oh, there's a hint right there. And it happens all the time. So we can be detectives put our skills to work and find out where foreshadowing is mentioned in the story. It happens all the time. And it's funny because the characters themselves don't know the outcome of the story, yet they're foreshadowing the outcome by their own words, coincidentally. And that's clever. That means the author is putting in their mouths kind of this foreshadowing aspects of, that they've said that they don't even know are going to come true at some point. So cool. Look out for foreshadowing as an element of a creative device of an author. And then we look at the structure of the play. So Shakespeare designs his plays into 5 parts usually, and they follow a similar pattern. And I've read a couple Shakespearean plays that follow this pattern, and Romeo and Juliet does quite well. And in the first act, you could sort of see it as the first part of the play, we see the introduction, the setting, the conflict, the characters. We get an idea to the point and people and the situation of the story. So that's the role of Act 1. When we move on to Act 2, we're going to see rising action. And that's when we see the play take off, the characters attempting to resolve this problem. Act 3, we see the turning point where the rising action comes to a point that kind of tumbles down into this falling action in Act 4. And then we see this irresistible flow. Okay, nobody can prevent it, into Act 5, which leads to the tragic resolution of the play. So actually, we spend a little bit more time on these, and normally we would in class, but you can sort of maybe see how the play falls into this pattern. As I said, the first act will tell us the background of the characters and the main problem, the story. The second act will tell us when the main character, so it's the rising action, the main character takes action in an attempt to solve a problem that he comes across here. Yet in doing so, okay, the character is faced in Act 3 with a choice, or the characters are faced with a choice. And that choice will determine if the ending will be happy or sad. It's interesting because at this point in Act 3, if the character made a different choice, it wouldn't be a tragedy. It could be a very happy ending. And so Act 4 carries on with that choice that's made. The result of the choice, it tumbles that character into deeper and deeper into tragedy because of that turning point up here in Act 3. Act 4 flows into Act 5, which is the climax of the story, the pinnacle of the tragic ending of the story. We know who's going to win or who's going to lose out in the story at the end. And usually in a tragedy, the main characters die. And even if they die, it doesn't mean there's no resolution. The resolution still happens, and the play is resolved, even though it's a tragic ending. So that is our look at Shakespeare, his design of plays, and some of the kind of devices and elements that you might find within a Shakespearean play. So last but not least, in our introduction, we're going to look at characters in the story. I don't want to give away too much here, but I want to introduce you to the different characters you're going to see in the story. You can always come back to this slide to kind of get an idea of who the characters are and sort them out in your mind. Now, I don't think there's too many characters in this story. There are enough that it makes it somewhat of a challenge, but if we get them in the right order, if we figure out who they are, then the story will actually make sense quite well. So our objective here is to identify the characters of the story. So let's go ahead and look at each of these characters. So characters are people in the story. There are different kinds of characters in the story, just like there are different people in the world. The one thing that's awesome about Shakespeare is that all his characters are distinctly different. They're all very realistic, and they all kind of inhabit different human traits and qualities. And it's very complex the way he's able to characterize these people and make them really believable to us just by using pen and paper. Okay. Now, in this case, we have protagonist, or in this slide, we have protagonist and antagonist. A protagonist is a main character who is the good person. Pro means we're for them. Okay. We're in favor of them. the protagonist is the guy we're rooting for. So the protagonist in our story is going to be the person that we're hoping will have the happy ending at the end. Now, the antagonist is an anti, the anta, the counter, character, the one who we're not in favor of, we're against. He's the person or thing that's against the protagonist. Usually, we're not cheering for them. Now, interestingly, the protagonist can be his own antagonist and lead to his own self-destruction. So there's elements of that, okay, in the story. But ideally, we look at the idea of protagonist and antagonist and their distinct characters. And it's kind of a common trait in characterization in any sort of literature. So who's in the play? Well, we know who's in the play are the Capulets, which we mentioned already, and the Montagues. And you see they're depicted by these little cherubs fighting and sticking their tongues out at each other. Why? Well, the Capulets are Lady and Lord Capulet. They are Juliet's parents. They were a noble family in Verona. They are more wealthy and important to Verona society. The Capulets were ruthless. They like things to be done their way. They're kind of stubborn, entitled, wealthy people. The Montagues are Romeo's parents. They're Lord and Lady Montague. They were a noble family. Again, another rich, wealthy family in the city of Verona. Very powerful. The Montagues were nicer, at least they're less involved in the play, but we get the idea that they're a little bit more gentle, I guess, nicer, preferred. They do look down on the Capulets, though, and the two of them hate one another. So the two families that are what? Feuding. That's right. So let's get into the characters of the story. So our most important characters of the play are Romeo and Juliet. Now, Romeo, he's the main character of the story. He's full of passion, full of romantic feelings. He is often understood to be kind of a young teenager, full of romantic passion, looking for love. He seems to be a guy who rushes into things before thinking them through. So he shows a lot of impulse. Okay, he's acting impulsively just based on his feelings. He seems to be rash and act quickly without thinking them through, as it says. Now, Juliet is also one of the main characters of the story, obviously. She's in the title, after all. She's only 13 years old in the story, so she actually is given an age. But she doesn't act like a child. She's fairly mature. This is in the 1300s, after all, where people grew up and matured maybe quite quickly. She's a very strong-willed character, interestingly enough, and kind of makes demands and insists on things and takes initiative and that type of stuff. But she also acts kind of rashly and quickly without thinking them through, based on emotions and that type of thing. She falls for Romeo instantly too. So the two of them are kind of really entangled in this idea of love at first sight and that type of thing. Okay. Anything else to say about them? Well, you'll learn more about them as we go through the play. But they are Romeo and Juliet, and actually they start off the play not knowing who the other is. So even though they've grown up in the same town as the only offspring, I should say, the only children of their two parents, they have never met. They don't know each other exists. So the next set is Juliet's parents. They are the Capulets. They're called Lord Capulet or Capulet in the play, and Lady Capulet. And Lord Capulet's her father. He's an influential member of Verona's society, the aristocracy or nobility. He does love his daughter, Juliet, but he demands her obedience. I think he is looking out for her success, her status, her comfort, those types of things. And he'll provide for them. As we will see in the play, one of the things he shows us is by arranging a marriage for her. And he wants her to be married off well. And he'll ensure that that happens. Okay. Yet we'll also see that he cherishes her very, very much. She is his only daughter and is really, his whole estate, his whole wealth is tied up in her success. Okay. If she doesn't carry on the family name, nobody else will. Okay. Lady Capulet is Juliet's mom. She's probably my least favorite character in the story. She even looks kind of nasty here. She's Juliet's mom. She's also influential in Verona society. She's ambitious. We know that she married up in Verona society to marry Lord Capulet. And she kind of seems, I don't know, like, is this out of love or was this out of status that the two married? Now she wants the same for Juliet. She wants him to marry somebody wealthy, somebody with status, so that she can kind of up in the society, just like Lady Capulet did. So that's Lady Capulet for you. I appreciate her a little bit less. Even her interaction with Juliet doesn't seem the most motherly. And so I think she might be more out there for the comfort and status, even than being a mother. Unless that was just something social at the time that noble women were not really motherly to their kids. In any case, we move on to Romeo's parents, Lord Montague. He was Romeo's father. He was wealthy and important as well. He loves his son and worried about Romeo's happiness at the beginning. There's not a lot about these two characters. They pop in from time to time. They show their concern for Romeo, but that's about it. Okay, we know that Romeo's mother is very kind and emotional. She loves her son and husband, and kind of seems to act. Maybe we get why Romeo acts the way he does. She kind of seems to be influenced by her emotions and feelings and those types of sensations, and they kind of have a lot to do with what she physically then feels and experiences in life, as we will see at the end. And then we have a couple other characters. Now, so we have Romeo and Juliet and their parents. Then we have some other figures. Let's go through them. Benvolio. Benvolio is Romeo's cousin, around a similar age, we assume, and a friend. So they're close. He is a guy who tends to be the peacemaker. That's his trait. He's the one who breaks up fights. He tries to stop the fights that start. And why would fights be starting again? Oh, yeah. I remember the Montagues and the Capulets hate each other. Mercutio. Mercutio is actually a relative of the prince of the town. He's Romeo's best friend. He's a bit of a jokester. He always teases other characters in the play. Unfortunately, Mercutio's teasing angers the wrong person. He's a kind of a jokester type of guy, and gets him into trouble, as we will see. And he's also somebody who is an example of foreshadowing. So he will state examples of foreshadowing without even knowing it that show Romeo's, upcoming doom. The characters in the other end. So this is Romeo's friends. These are on the Montague side of the spectrum. And here we have Tybalt, who is a Capulet. He is Juliet's cousin, a relative of Juliet. From her household. He's actually a hothead who tends to get into resort to violence or force. He wants to fight anybody that he comes across. He thinks he's fighting for the honor of his family, but really he's harming that reputation, getting himself into trouble and others into trouble. So Tybalt, somebody you want to look out for. He's Juliet's cousin. In the town of Verona, we've got Prince Aeschylus. He's the Prince of Verona, the head of Verona's courts. He makes sure both the Capulets and Montagues keep the peace. That's his job. He rules the city, but he's also the law. So he could come in and say, hey, I am the law, stop, or here I make up a new law. The new law is this. And he gets to decide what their judgment is. Okay. So he needs to keep a peaceful town, but he can't because the Montagues and Capulets keep fighting. So Prince Aeschylus has a bit of a role in the story. He's like the judge and the prince. Other characters we have are these two. They're like the friends, the people that Romeo and Juliet can each confide in, can trust. They're the closest adults that Romeo and Juliet have to kind of mentor them. In terms of Juliet, the nurse is Juliet's nanny. She's a real character who loved and cares for Juliet as if Juliet were her own daughter. And the nurse is called Nurse because she nursed Juliet from an infant and has continued to nanny her from those years onward. So she is more of a motherly figure to Juliet than Juliet's own mother, and somebody who Juliet would trust as if she was a mother. And then we have Friar Lawrence. Friar Lawrence is Romeo's counselor and friend. He's called a friar. A friar is a type of monk. A monk is a type of clergy. He lives in a monastery. So part of a religious... He's a religious man, a holy man, a man of God, like a priest, that type of person. In fact, he is a priest because he can marry people. He and hear confessions and that type of thing. So he's Romeo's counselor, somebody who gives him advice. He's good and kind. He hopes that by marrying Romeo and Juliet, that he will end the feud. He is a man of God. He wants peace, just like the prince does, and he thinks he has a solution. Okay, a little bit. That's enough of Friar Lawrence. A little bit more on him, obviously, as we get into the play, but I don't want to give away too much. No, he thinks he's got all the solutions. He tries to be a problem solver, but seems to be a problem creator. The other characters we have in the story are the County Paris. He is a count, important nobleman. He is a relative of Prince Aeschylus, and he's the one who asked Juliet's father for Juliet's hand in marriage, and part of that arranged marriage I already mentioned. And then we have a bunch of servants in the story, servants of both the Capulets and Montagues. And it's interesting because they have their loyalties, and they're either going to be loyal to the Montague family or the Capulet family, and they'll join in fighting on whichever side that they're loyal to. Okay? That is the characters of the story. So we have Romeo and Juliet, their two parents. We've got the two friends, the cousin and the friend of Romeo. We've got Tybalt, who's Juliet's cousin. And then we have the prince and County Paris. And then we have the nurse and Friar Lawrence. And then we have the servants and other random people who show up in the story that aren't too important. So that's about it. That's our story. Those are the characters in the story that we have. So that wraps it up. I invite you to go ahead and take a look at the comprehension checks, the quizzes for this introduction. See what you picked up on. But I think if you have looked at all of these things, you are more than equipped to delve into the play with me. And with that, I invite you to not be lame, to help us out. Go ahead and follow the assignments as they're posted as much as you can, to dedicate a little bit of your time every day to make sure that you're plugging away at the story and following along with us as we explore and adventure through the story of Romeo and Juliet. Take care, DBL.